to assume that we are live and that I am being heard. And it looks like that is the case. Okay, we didn't know just how live we were going to be. All right, good to see everyone. Thanks for coming and being part of our conversation, art making as spiritual practice. I want to start by, I'm Paul Briggs. I want to start by thanking NCECA for putting together such a great conference for us. It's actually pretty cool. It's working out. So grateful for that. I also want to thank the panel, um, Varuni Kanaгаsundaram, Ben Carter, and Heather Brin for being part of the conversation. And so what we hope to do is to be able to spend about 5 minutes doing a little introduction for each of us, about 5 minutes each answering questions that I pose to the panel, and then we'll chat for a little bit, hopefully, and then we can all leave and otherwise chase the muse. So I hope that is how it works out. So thanks for being here. And if you are here, then that means you have been suspicious that something that you did in your studio was spiritual. And I came to a point in my practice where I realized that if I was going to be meditative, spiritual, prayerful at all, it was going to be the work. It was going to be in the studio. And so the reason why I chose this image is because when I was at Penland, this was the first time that I realized I was going to have to try to do public what I usually do private. I wanted to move some pieces beyond the demo, okay, so that I would have something that really came out with my vibration as part of it. And so this piece, when I saw these photos, I was like, oh, I think maybe I went there. So what do we mean by spiritual practice? And the reason why I joke about the term suspicious is because usually that term we are associating more with traditional vehicles to inner development. And what they see in this definition, that it really has to do with inner development, with what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi calls becoming a more complex individual, growing on the inside, gaining greater equanimity and balance, so that one's inside is not thrown off by something on your outside. Also, we have the ideal of becoming more compassionate, that somehow in that particular flow state, which Ben probably will say more about, that flow state, we grow, we become more complex, and then that spills out into the community as social action, as social justice. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, so to bookend this in some way, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about the flow state. This is not to be confused with like peak experience. This is not to be confused with being in the zone. Flow can be found in any practice, but the ideal is that there's a challenge and then there's a skill level, and that they move along at this pace. If the challenge is less than the skill, there's boredom. If it's more than, it's frustration. It just outpaces it, which is why we're always pushing our mediums further so that we move into that flow state. And the other bookend of this is Kandinsky, and in his book concerning the spiritual in art, talks about that artists are the seers in society, the prophets of society, that they have a vision, and that he breaks this triangle. He describes this triangle of artists being in each segment of the triangle, and that they can look into the next segment, but not beyond. and that it is important to have artists in each segment to pull that segment forward, and so on and so on. And artists who, again, can't see past the next segment, but they can see into it. And as Kandinsky says, they pull the obstinate whole forward. So what we do find is that the arts are really at the beginning of most movements, most social justice, most acts of compassion. Although we have everything from the spilling out of compassion, the moving of society forward, but we also just have that flow state, which many of us do go for. And so I was talking about this, and somebody picked up on it, and they said, well, you know, is it artists who are already compassionate, who are making work, or, you know, or is it the practice? And I was like, I really don't know what came first, you know, the egg of contemplative practice or the chicken of compassion. But that's my brief introduction to the conversation. And now we will hear from, pardon that slide, Varuni Kanaгаsundaram.
Thank you, Paul. That was a great introduction to the panel discussion. And I want to commence by saying, we'll just move to the next slide. Art making and spiritual practice come together simultaneously, and they become intertwined. And that's what I want to really discuss in my 5 minutes. So they come together without separation, and it allows a communion of the subconscious, the unconscious, and the conscious in a state of flow that Paul mentioned, where the concept of flow, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi developed. At times, you know, we feel we are being led without that awareness of being led. And when we are in that flow, and there's full immersion in that activity. And as we enter, we also enter into a different rhythm of time. There's a deep engagement with the space, all that encompasses all the elements in that space, and being transported to a place of unknown, but also wonderment. We may call upon our ancestors, which I do in my practice, and also ancestors of the land we might be creating at the time of the creating. We enter into this state even before we commence the physical making itself. We become also deeply absorbed in the materiality of the clay, responding to our hands through every action and reaction, and then its transformation through the various stages to a form. Michael Leunig, who's an Australian artist and a philosopher and a political cartoonist, an acute observer of society, whom I admire, described, and I quote, so this is the notion of spirituality as an ongoing internal lyrical state of consciousness, semi-consciousness, and unconsciousness, in which I find meaning, comfort, refuge, inspiration, mystery, and strength. Next slide, please, Paul. My art making translates rituals of South Asia, which you saw in that first slide, and practices of women. And they take the form of objects and offerings, but also capture devotional practices. The ephemeral threshold ritual of Kolam particularly is a focus in my practice. And it involves a drawing made at the entrance to a home, and it's transient by nature, and the design gradually erodes as it merges with the ground as people step on it before they enter the home. And the drawing itself, that's a good indication. On the left is a traditional one, and in the middle, I'm doing the translation. The drawing serves to convey a message and also differentiates space and time. It could be interpreted as a daily prayer or a dialogue with the universe in the form of a drawing. And these are not, they become not separated in terms of, they're not isolated from social, cultural, domestic, or religious roles. And they all, again, become intertwined. And it is this integration that is important in my translation into ceramics. The ritual, the threshold ritual, is used as a metaphor for crossing boundaries. And in my case, I'm looking at boundaries crossed by migrants, the departure from one space and you're entering into another. And you could consider art making as crossing thresholds. So leaving one and entering into another. And have been described, and it's been described by John O'Donoghue as it divides, it's a frontier that divides two different rhythms and atmospheres. And we move to the next slide. And the expression of the ephemeral and impermanence and permanence through use of materiality of clay conveys a spiritual relationship to the state of loss, transience, fragmentation, healing in the gathering of those fragments, and memory. And all these are experienced by displaced, through displacement. So we all experience displacement. And fragility, fragmentation, and the ephemeral quality of column, the drawing that I mentioned, conveyed through exploitation of the materiality of clay. And the translation of objects and material and gestural actions are part of the repetitive acts in ritual. And this is conveyed at every stage of the making. The action of the participant, so this is the audience, by stepping on fragile pieces created, this is a creative work, and interaction of the natural elements changes the integrity. So I want people to reflect on those aspects of what it is to lose that integrity of the original. And in the last slide, where I'm engaging with community participation and allows the audience to enter into the experience of making anew, but also transience and uncertainty. In current times, we all have been affected by this during the global pandemic. And characteristics of time and space intrinsic to ritual practice, as well as transformation of traditional practices, are captured in clay. And the role of the artist as a ritual creator and performer is not only conveying meaning of the act of ritual, but also has agency in how they shape that meaning. And art making is an offering to community, but also as a creator, we get to experience that sense of offering. So I will end with that note.
Thank you, Varuni.
Thank you, Paul.
Excellent.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Varuni, and Heather for being a part of this. It's an honor to be presenting here with you today. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about my own spiritual practice and how that's been interwoven with my creative practice. They're, at this point, almost inseparable. So let's start with that first image. This is a pot made by Will Ruggles and Douglas Rankin, who I got a chance to spend a good bit of time with when I was a student at Appalachian State University, which is in Boone, North Carolina. At the time I was in school, I was visiting and starting to meditate regularly at a center called the Sedoan Temple, which was a Soto temple of Zen Buddhism. And as I learned more about Buddhism, I had kind of two goals. One is that I wanted to be able to understand my mind. You know, I experienced a lot of anxiety growing up as a child, even as an adult, on and off. And so meditation, I had a goal. I was hoping to tame myself. But I also wanted to understand a tradition, an aesthetic tradition that went back to Seiichi Yanagi, who was a philosopher that was attached to the Mingyei movement. And I really loved these pots that were made by Soji Hamada and other artists that were a part of this movement. And I kept seeing these references to Zen. So when I went to Will and Douglas to talk to them about pots, I was looking for an aesthetic. I really wanted them to give me the answer for both the secrets to life and the secrets to being a good potter. But what was interesting is the more we talked about Buddhism and the more we talked about clay, they kept reinforcing something, which is that there's no shortcuts. There's no way to clarify your mind without the activity of mindfulness. There's no set of beliefs that you can just adopt by reading on a piece of paper and then all of a sudden your mind is clear as a bell. And they also said the same thing about clay, is that I couldn't just expect that by watching them work that I would receive the aesthetic benefit of all of their labor. I needed to have a creative practice myself. So next slide. So at this time, I was going to the temple and working with the abbot. It was a man named Tozan, named Tom Hardison. And we would do all sorts of things at the temple. We would work on cleaning up brush. We would polish the floors. We would do lots of these different things. And he one day said to me that a lot of what we're doing is chopping wood, carrying water. And that was a little confusing in the beginning because we weren't chopping wood or carrying water. But I learned that this was a Zen saying. And it's a saying that it's kind of hard to pinpoint where it comes from. But there was a layman monk named Pong that lived in 740 AD. And he had written this in his diary. My supernatural power and marvelous activity is drawing water and chopping wood. So from his first stating this, it kind of got passed down the lineage of Zen teacher to student. And by the time I heard it, it turned into this saying, which is that a novice asks a master, what does one do before enlightenment? And the master replies, chop wood, carry water. The novice asks, well, then what do you do after enlightenment? And the master says, chop wood, carry water. So this type of what I thought was nonsensical when I first heard this, what it actually points to is that the activity itself, the mindful action of chopping wood and carrying water, or in our case as clay people, firing kilns, glazing, throwing, all of these things, it's the activity itself that can establish a clarity of mind that is enlightenment. There's no stage you reach in which you just automatically have it. It's the process itself that both leads towards a refinement of the mind, but also is the enlightenment itself. And that started to make sense to me because I could see that in my own, clay practice, as well as my meditation as I continued to meditate on a daily basis. So next slide. So you can see with this video, Paul, if you can play that video, this is a video of Chris Staley applying slip to a cup. And one of the things that's amazing about ceramics is that it's responsive. When you watch this video, you can probably feel the clay on your skin because you've had that same experience, being solely focused on the task you're doing. And I started to read the writings of actually someone who's already been mentioned twice, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who is a psychologist who had written about flow states. And there's actually 10 characteristics that are about flow that he writes, but I'm just going to focus on 3. One is having a clear goal. 2 is having strong concentration and focused attention. And then the 3rd is losing feelings of self-consciousness. So think about this in your own practice. When I have gotten to these states of intense concentration, I'm not worried about anything else. I am only focused on that pot, that slip, that glaze in that moment, which I think that is part of the power of this concept that what we're doing is spiritual. It's that ability to lose self or maybe transcend self through repetitive creative action. So let's go to that last slide. So this is actually a totally different conversation, though, than the aesthetics of what we're all making. Because what I'm talking about here is a mindset during the act of creation. It is a mindfulness and practice. It is not saying whether what I'm making is good or bad. And actually, what I've found is that the judging of good and bad is a trap. And I found that in myself in the studio. If I'm thinking about how good or bad something is while I'm making it, it does not work out well. I've found it's best to focus in a contemplative state while making and then judge later after the making process is done, but not together. And I think that's really important because that good and bad in the Sing Sing Ming, which is an old Buddhist sutra, they talk about that good and bad is a trap, that we literally get trapped in this mindset of saying, is this good? Is this bad? What can I change? What can I do? That is the monkey mind that I was trying to avoid by Buddhist meditation. So it's nice to think that through ceramic practice, through focusing on a pot like this, just focusing on each brushstroke, on the feeling of the brush in my hand, on the experience of smelling clay in the studio, all of these sense experiences, I can actually lose myself. So that is something that Paul Briggs and I talked about in an interview I did with him for my podcast, which I hope you guys will listen to that at some point. He has some interesting thoughts about everything. He's a brilliant man, and it's an honor to be on a panel with him. But in our discussion, he said this one thing. The Dalai Lama had talked about a creative practice has the potential to produce an enlightened state when the practice leaves the person more compassionate and loving and having more equanimity. So this is the Dalai Lama that said that, but Csikszentmihalyi could also have said that. And philosophers 1,000 years before that could also have said that. Like, this is a tradition that we're talking about of focus. So thank you, guys. That's all that I have.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. We are getting there. Heather, all yours. Good. I mean it. Yeah. What's happening with Heather? Is Heather in the house, or is she having internet work?
I'm unmuting from my iPhone. I'm so sorry, you guys. Hi. All right. I was actually just like taking a few breaths after Ben and Varuni and Paul, all the wisdom you've already shared. It's really an honor to be sharing this platform with all of you. Paul, thank you for arranging all of this. And Nsika, thank you for making this COVID Virginia conversation to happen this year virtually. It's been a long wait, but it's also been a journey into more spiritual thinking in this time that we find ourselves in. Paul, if we could go to the first slide, which I think is just my headshot, I apologize. And mostly I want to start out here because you can see that I teach at Bethel University, and Bethel University is a school with specific affiliations. And for me, it's really important to say that I am an ex-evangelical and that I never was an evangelical. It's especially important in our culture right now to, I think, make a label for the political movement that is not a spiritual movement. So that's all I'm going to say there. I'm not interested in debating theology. I'm just interested in sharing my experience as a creator of my life, as a creator of art, as a creator of my faith. And in fact, this brings me to my first sort of like inspiration, Makoto Fujimura. He talks about the generativity that art making is for the production of culture. And I really have come to adapt that mindset of generativity as a way of expanding my creative practice through my whole life. So growing up within evangelical culture, I would also say that I came from a background of religious fundamentalists, and creativity was one of my my moments of freedom, my moments of breath that I was able to have. So just to clarify one last time, it's important to say that if you think you know what it is that I'm going to say based on an assumption of identity based on where I teach, you are going to be extremely wrong. So I want to take you to a moment when I was in my car shortly after graduate school. I was listening to Terry Gross's Fresh Air, and Rosanne Cash was on, and she made a statement that at the time I probably thought was heretical, that she said, "Art is my religion." And it hit me like a ton of bricks, because I knew it was also my faith as well. Like I knew that art was my faith, and I didn't know necessarily how to talk about that. Well, from that like notion, I began just consuming everything I could about the relationship between creativity and spirituality. Meanwhile, I'm teaching at a conservative institution. So, Paul, if you could give me the next slide. Some of the things I was observing in my students about their creativity, especially as religious fundamentalists, I noticed that some of their like stages of human development were a bit delayed. And I also noticed in myself, looking back at my own creative emergence, that I was stuck in some of these stages of development because of how I was sort of indoctrinated to think about things. So this brought me to studying ontology, the branch of metaphysics that deals with the nature and quality of our being. And I started to see an overlap in the quality of my creativity and the quality in my spirituality. And in fact, I was able to start to chart it out. You guys, I did the most religiously fundamentalist thing I could have ever done. I made a rubric for creativity, but it is not, you know, fundamentalist in heart. I really enjoy going back and forth between different systems of good and bad. And I like to see the middle. I like to flip them on their head. And so the rubric that I've created about creativity is actually more about your formation as a human and creating the self in a more deeper way. And it's meant to be a formative document, not a punitive one. And I found that in dialogue with my students, I was absolutely able to walk along someone's faith journey as they were also in my classroom making art, and I was able to challenge them in new ways. All right, last slide, please, Paul. And here I'd like to credit Steven Pressfield with his The War of Art, where he set up a creative dichotomy of being in a state of resistance or in a state of surrender. And for me, I took those dichotomies and I started looking through, like, you know, the Beatitudes and how we could read those in indifference and how we could then apply those to our creativity. And so that's what's up on the board there right now, or on the screen, excuse me. So I'm well aware that you cannot serve two gods at the same time. And essentially that's what this slide is about, right? We can't be in a state of indifference or a state of love at the same moment. But I found that where I can bring everything together, my whole being, is in the moment where I am being faithfully creative. So, like Roseanne Cash, art's my religion, people. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So as you've heard, our panelists are coming to this this journey from very different places, and I think we're getting to a similar
What is
location.
this one spiritual thing? Oh.
But I would like to ask the panelists a couple of questions. But before we move into this question time, Heather reminded me that we wanted to begin the session by taking a breath together with all of you. And so if we could pause at this time and just breathe one in and breathe one out, that would be great. And we're breathing in. And okay. It reminds me of Dr. King saying we must live together as brothers and sisters and others, I guess, and or perish together as fools. So whenever we take that breath together, I think of that. We're breathing together. So for the panelists, does creative practice need a teaching to accompany the process in order to be a spiritual practice? Let's go back to the beginning, Varuni.
Thanks, Paul. I think you know, we slot education in, or education can occur through very different domains, and I had to ponder on that. And but teaching of creative practice that it nurtures, to nurture and encourage and equip a person with a spectrum of tools in the form of skills. So the more you have available to you, I think the more you then have got a potential to explore deeper. So that's where I think education or teaching can help. And in modern society, particularly, it can benefit immensely. The fast pace and technology, modernization and compartmentalization, particularly, I think, draws us away from knowledge or experience. It's really a spectrum of experience, which otherwise in generations past, we may have had experiences with elders, for instance, or a village, or so skills and knowledge and experience become part of that creative practice, perhaps. But now I think we don't have that readily available. And that's where teaching can assist in interconnecting those. And also tacit knowledge, which used to be probably there's a role for tacit knowledge, but now again, because it's compartmentalized, there is less availability for that. So incorporation of all that teaching can assist in bringing benefit to how spiritual practice and art making can come together to have deep relevance.
Thank you, Varuni. The reason why I included this picture of Dr. King, because Abraham Heschel is here. and he was criticized for marching with Dr. King. And they said, you know, you're a rabbi, you should be studying the Torah and meditating in that way and praying. And his response was, well, I am praying. I'm praying with my feet. So he kind of switched his spiritual practice, but then he gives a teaching about it. So Ben, what do you think? Creative practice need a teaching for the process?
Yeah, for me, it has. Those have always been linked. So it's hard for me to speculate outside of my own experience. But for me, you know, I was actually a high school teacher that I was lucky enough to learn both clay and to start a spiritual path in high school. And it was a woman named Julie Bailey. And she was the first person to sit down and explain that there was a tradition of spiritual practice that went back as long as the creative practices did. So she was talking to me about, you know, in different eras, you might call someone a healer, but in a different, you know, in the subsequent era, you might call them a minister. And in a subsequent era after that, you might call them an artist, or now we might call them a comedian, you know, or a psychologist. Like we have all these different terms for being able to get to that kernel of truth. And I think what the teaching does is it's a system to get us there. So I'm a systems guy, you know, like I like that routine involved with meditation in the breathing meditation that I do. And I also like the routine in the studio. So for me, those two have been linked together, and it's very helpful to have them be linked together into a system.
I had one of my mentors, when I posed this question, said, nope, no teaching necessary. Just get in there and make work. It'll spill out somehow. You know, I'm not sure. So Heather, what do you think?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on this. For me, I needed anti-teaching because teaching was what I was trained to do. I'm so sorry about my dog. So I needed anti-teaching because I didn't know necessarily how to be honest with myself. I needed anti-teaching because of perfectionism. And I see this a lot in my students. I see the need for perfectionism in order to validate one's practice. And I think that that's totally backwards. That makes the destination the objective as opposed to the journey. And I think we're all talking about very seriously here that art is a process of making yourself. And so for me, I mean, Paul, maybe I might also say that no, you need no teaching because it sort of comes along with you. I will say, how about this, that you do need a practice. And a lot of what I heard you, Ben, say was about the discipline, meeting the opportunity for enlightenment, and that chop wood, carry water is that moment of discipline. And so I will say from a conservative upbringing is that there were many practices in discipline that I think were very relevant for bringing over into my identity as an artist. And yeah, I think I needed anti-teaching in order to learn how to be truly honest. Paul, how about that?
Okay. All right. So we're all in different places, but that's what a conversation is all about. So thank you all for working on that one. Ben, I think I already know where you are with this one. Do the fragility of the process and intensive labor involved in ceramics, like wedging clay, recycling, reconstituting, I mean, all the carrying something bone hard to the kiln, you know, all of those things. Does it make it uniquely suited to be a spiritual practice? I think you can probably knock that one off pretty quickly, Ben.
Yeah, I think it does, only because it needs attention. So I think that the fragility of clay is much like the fragility of holding a child, like a baby. You know, when you're holding a child, you don't want to squeeze the child, but you want to pay attention to the child. You don't want to just throw him over your shoulder and, carry him around. You're going to hurt that kid. The same with clay. But it's the fragility of the material also is what then leads to its strength. Like once we fire clay, it is some of the most durable. That's our historical record is made up of thousands and thousands of years worth of pots that have survived the test of time. So I think that the fragility is only helpful in that it is an attention grabbing thing.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ben. I'm sorry, I was trying to take in some of the chat. And Varuni, clay practice suited to spiritual practice.
Ben, I quite really like that. It's quite poetic what you said about in that initial period of the care, like a child. I couldn't have put it better. But in that child growing up, now it's strengthened. There's something in that care is necessary, that attention is necessary, but it's also valuing the preciousness. There's a preciousness which you pay attention, and almost every, you're so aware also of your body. You're so aware of where each finger of your hand is, and the attention you need to pay to it. And all that, I think, lends itself to, I think, a deep, and time, so again, you also forget about time. Whatever time it takes, that's what it takes for you to pay attention. And that lends itself to that notion of the practice, that discipline and the spiritual practice lending itself to art making, or the both together in a way. They are intertwined. Yeah.
That timepiece is fascinating. I like to try to describe that flow experience by talking about kids and the kids that are outside playing kickball, and they're not hungry. They don't even want to go home. They don't want to stop to go to the bathroom. Sometimes the reason why that came to me is because my bathroom is right there. And sometimes I'm in my studio now and find myself running to the bathroom because I just wanted to do one more pinch, So that timepiece is significant. Heather, how about it? And I want you to think about this. I'm going to pose a question that's not here. Does what we do have to spill out into the world as compassion to be a spiritual practice? Heather, can you talk about the labor piece? Or you can take that one if you choose.
Okay, I can take that one. So I think creativity is rooted in love. That's it. I mean, I can expand on that a little bit more. How about with the analogy of a garden? Because I'm also a gardener around my house during the wintertime here in Minnesota and out in the yard in the summer. And I talk about the idea of like, how about pulling weeds, right? We get this notion that when we're weeding, we're all done. And then those weeds creep back up. And we go, oh, I know how to pull that weed, right? And then that one dandelion has that root that goes all the way to the other side of the world, and you just can't get it. And it stumps you every single time. And I'm often drawn to the cultivation of the garden as the cultivation of myself. What am I planting? What are my intentions? What is my, how am I feeding my garden? How am I providing supplements? And so it's this living thing, because it is my spirituality, right? it needs tending, and it needs love in order to exist. Otherwise, right, if we have indifference toward our art, we don't want to show it to anybody. If we have disgust towards our art, we're definitely not going to show it to anybody. It might even stop us from making, but we need love just to show up in the studio.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. I'm going to let that question hang out there a little bit, Ben and Varuni, because I do want to get the questions from the participants, those here who are part of the conversation. Maybe we'll come around to it. We'll see. Alex, can you pull some questions from the chat for us, please?
Sure. So Magdalene asked a question of Heather, whether you are comfortable talking about your journey to ex-evangelical and the guilt, shame that may have been involved, and how you started moving past that.
Very slowly. You know, I've been on a path creatively of deconstructing the world around me in order to reconstruct it. And I'll say that that has absolutely guided my spiritual emergence out of extreme conservatism. It hasn't been without hiccups. But mostly, I guess I'd say it's been in mining the experiences of others. I actually have a list of 21 books that are right behind me that I've read in order to be able to not have to reinvent everything. So I can indeed share that with everyone right here, right now. And I will say, probably the most profound work in that list, The Courage to Create by Rollo May. Yeah, a lot of reading, a lot of podcasts, a lot of inner work, a lot of extended as the rebel. You can imagine, coming from religious fundamentalism, that I'm not widely accepted by that culture. And I would say that's true even in my own family. So I've been identified as the rebel, and instead of seeing it as a negative label like I was raised to see it as, I see it more how Paul, when you introduced Kandinsky's ways of the artists pushing culture forward, I see the rebel as that same agent. The rebel is the child questioning constructs, and hopefully that rebel voice is the voice of the future. And so I've embodied that position. I've really dug into these ideas. I've talked with anybody who will listen to me, and I'm creating this path with others as we go along.
You know, this conversation is being had everywhere.
Yeah.
In Buddhist circles, remember, the Dalai Lama is the one who coined this term, secular spirituality. And I don't know if you heard that podcast with Kristen Wyman and Krista Tippett on being.
Most likely.
He talks about being called to unbelief.
Yes.
In order to have a greater faith. Very interesting. We have another question. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so Jeremiah asks, I think some of you spoke a little bit to this already, but I often feel like artists, and in particular art teachers, are like clergy spreading the word. Can you all speak to integrating a role as spiritual guide into teaching?
I'm gonna leave that one alone. Let's see, I'm the moderator, I can pass. Ben's brave. And Baruni.
Bruni, I'm gonna let you go first.
Well, I'll probably enter into this in a very with a breadth, with breadth to it, which is there's a plurality with which I usually undertake that notion of spiritual or or intent. So how I even arrive at the space, and often I don't articulate this, it's not, I just allow, you're often, it's in a solitary space. Somebody could be witnessing whilst one is making, but most often you are your only witness, so to speak, but often you're unaware when you are in that immersive state. But when you are, I think it is, there is I know when those optimal states are when there is a real, we go back to that flow. I have no idea of where one is heading. That is the optimal. And every action and response is around you, and you are just like a child. So there's an innocence about that. That's the closest thing that I will bring it to. And you see that in nature, where there is a balance, and whatever occurs in equilibrium and that equanimity. And so there's a plurality with which I enter, not of any specific, and that intent to be a generous one. That is probably the closest thing that I can come to.
The book that I put in, Varuni, Cultivating the Spirit, one of the things, the advice that they give is that the best things you can do for your students is to be transparent and to be vulnerable and to let them know that you are still asking questions.
Yes.
What's that song? Oh, I'm aging myself. When all the world's asleep, these questions run too deep for such a simple mind. So that ideal of just letting it spill out naturally is kind of critical. Ben, sorry, Ben.
I think you brought up a good point, which is that non-hierarchical teaching environments can be, in my opinion, more spiritual than when there is a set hierarchy, because the teacher is acknowledging that we're involved in an intuitive act of teaching together. And that's something that I was raised in the spiritual tradition in Buddhism that I practice. But it's also something that I really saw in teachers that I related to the most, is that they wanted to get down dirty into the creativity of making with me. And I think I've done a lot of workshop teaching where we're together for a short amount of time, a week, a month, however long it is. And I love that because me as the teacher, I don't have to be someone who seems to have an answer. I'm someone who can ask questions and then enjoy that process of learning together with the students. And I found that the students enjoy that way better than when I first started teaching and I thought I needed to have some answers. I mean, that's like the biggest mistake of an early teacher is I felt like I needed to teach something as opposed to experience learning communally at the same time with someone else.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you, Varuni, Ben, Heather. Alex, how are we doing?
Yes, we have a couple more questions and not a lot of time. Okay. So the next question that popped up was from Robbie. I apologize if I don't get your name quite right. Can you speak about what it means to your spiritual practice when other people connect with your work and or support you by purchasing it? Mm-hmm. And then we have one last question, which is a meaty question.
Okay. Well, again, Kandinsky, John Dewey, Kandinsky, uh, uh, Deborah Koppelman, Reclaiming the Spiritual in Art, all talk about being in a particular place, having a particular, that vibration, that when you are fully in touch with that place in your creative practice, that is transferred to the work. And that can be picked up from those in the presence of and encountering the work. However you think of those things. You could think of it even just formally. I've paid such close attention that the work, matter of fact, that is a biological piece that has to do with labor in a piece. That's something about us as beings respond to labor intensive work. Talks about peacocks, peacocks, feathers, the whole yard. But there is something about that. So my own personal piece is that that I want to try and be in that place to put myself into the work. And again, I was thinking about how difficult that is to do during a demo. So Heather, Varuni, Ben, jump right in there.
Well, I make my art as a process of healing and self-discovery. So, you know, you buy one of my artworks and you're buying a bump along my spiritual journey that rocked my core. But it is in the work, no matter if I'm making installations or pottery, right? All come from my same interior, and they all kind of work from the same place.
So, Paul, there's one last question, which might be just a really longer thought to take with everyone that Josh has put in the chat. And I'll quickly preface it. When and how do our spiritual motivations for making and teaching art move from internal to social spaces? Josh wonders whether and how you think about the ways we might need to either focus our energies in the classroom, studios, or intersect with public policy and other systems in our schools and governments to see these kind of changes come to life.
Sure. No, it might have been Cornel West who said, there's barely a social action program that it will not get off the ground with some form of arts. So you're talking about the SNCC singers, you know what I mean? You're talking about a particular type of oration. You're talking about pussy hats. You're talking about all that type of creativity that accompanies movements, that the arts are part of that. In my own practice, really quick, most of the work had to do with my own kind of internal program, and I was out on the front lines. When I was no longer really kind of out on the front lines doing the work, I had to realize some type of conversation about what was going on in the world. It ended up being incarceration disproportionately of Black people, spilling out into the work. So I don't know, I want to give Ben and Varuni at least a minute to do it, and we are down to like a minute each.
The social practice piece is very interesting. I like that you said, is there a way to do public policy with this? And one of the unfortunate things is oftentimes internal spiritual practice, when turned into a system that's initiated by the government, becomes religious hierarchy. It becomes control. It's not about exploration as much as it is about the control of women's bodies, the control of people, the control of all these things. So I think there could be a place for that. It's a very tricky territory, but I like the thought of that. The system that I was thinking is Montessori schools often will mix things that are secularly spiritual into their every single part of their education practice. So that's a system that might work.
Rooney, last word.
Thank you. I agree. I tend to agree with Ben in that when it becomes too constrained in terms of policy, also it becomes too specific, and walls or fences go up. But how does it? However, it depends on how it is brought about, such that it can facilitate via certain institutions, mechanisms, etc., but to allow for however it's going to manifest itself. For me, of course, I find working with community and often this indicates that when you're in different organizations, how even within those you can see how you want. Has that gone out?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh.
We're looking at your lovely smile.
Okay, so I tend to think that it really depends very much the organizational structure itself, because I have experienced very different parts within projects where I've engaged with community. So it can be incorporated. It's about the how, but I'm acutely aware of allowing freedom for that expression to occur.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. Thanks again, Nsika. Sorry we couldn't get to all these wonderful questions. I don't know if we have time to put your emails in there, some contact information. I threw my email in so that we can continue the conversation. It's been rich. Thank you, and we'll see you out there.